When a cop burns a young black girl's cherished books, he never imagines her father is a renowned professor. What seems like a small mistake spirals into a powerful confrontation, forcing everyone to question their biases. Can one family's struggle inspire change, or will the cycle repeat? Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now let's get started. It was a quiet afternoon in the small suburban town of Briarwood, where the streets were lined with old trees and the sun cast long golden shadows across the neighborhood. Inside a modest house on Maple Street, 12-year-old Amara sat in her room, the soft hum of a ceiling fan the only sound breaking the silence. Her room was small but cozy, with stacks of books piled on the floor, some leaning against the walls, others neatly arranged on a wooden shelf. But these weren't just any books. They were her books, her escape, her connection to a world far beyond the narrow streets of her town. Amara flipped the pages of the book in her hands, her eyes scanning the words as if she were searching for something that would take her away from the daily struggles she faced. She knew that the world she read about in these pages was different from the world outside her window, a world where she didn't have to worry about people judging her based on her skin color. In the stories, in the history, in the knowledge, she felt powerful. She was intelligent and curious, with a hunger for learning that seemed endless. Every day she would read about distant lands, great leaders, and incredible people who made a difference in the world. These books were more than just stories. They were her safe space. They taught her about the importance of culture, the strength of resilience, and the power of education. Amara's love for books wasn't something she had just discovered on her own. It had been nurtured by her father, Professor Jamal, a man who seemed to know everything there was to know about history, culture, and social justice. Professor Jamal wasn't just any academic. He was well known, even respected, in his field. He taught at the local university, a small but respected institution in Briarwood. Though his name was known by many, it was his dedication to his students and his passion for change that truly defined him. At home, Amara was always by his side, sitting at his feet as he spoke about history, how the past shaped the present, and how the future could be different if people were willing to learn from the mistakes of yesterday. He taught her the importance of knowledge and understanding, of listening and respecting others. He had always told her that books weren't just words on pages. They were bridges to a better world. "Knowledge is power, Amara," he would say, his voice gentle but firm. "With education, you can change your world, and in time, you can change the world of those around you." For Amara, her father's words were more than just advice. They were a guiding light. She believed in them wholeheartedly. She wanted to grow up to be like him, smart, wise, and capable of making a difference. But as much as she loved to dream about the future, there was one thing she couldn't escape: the constant reminder that the color of her skin made her different. Every day, whether at school or out in the neighborhood, she faced the stares, the whispers, the assumptions. People looked at her and saw something they didn't understand, something they feared. In a world where her dreams seemed so far away, her books were the only place where she could feel truly free. On this quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Amara let the words of her book wash over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining a world where she didn't have to prove herself, a world where her dreams weren't limited by the color of her skin. In her mind, she was already someone important, someone who would change the world. All she needed was the chance. It was just after noon when Officer Daniels cruised through the quiet streets of Briarwood, his patrol car rolling smoothly along the pavement. The neighborhood was usually calm, suburban, peaceful, but every now and then something would stir up the usual routine. He had been working the same beat for years, and the streets felt familiar, almost predictable. He knew the faces, the houses, the rhythms of life in this small town. But that afternoon, something felt different. His radio crackled with a call. Suspicious person reported on Maple Street. A young black female, possibly loitering. Please check it out. Officer Daniels didn't think much of it at first. He had seen plenty of reports like this, nothing more than a neighborhood watch on high alert. But then, his eyes caught a glimpse of Amara. She was walking alone on Maple Street, her head buried in a book, completely unaware of the world around her. The sight made Officer Daniels pause for a moment. She seemed so peaceful, so absorbed in whatever story was unfolding on the pages. A child walking down the street, no different from any other. Yet something about her caught his attention. It wasn't just that she was walking alone, it was the book in her hand. A girl, a black girl, reading in the middle of the day, seemingly lost in thought, caught in a world that wasn't hers. Amara had always been the quiet, intelligent type. She never caused trouble. But to Officer Daniels, her presence was unusual. A young black girl walking around with a book. How many times had he seen similar situations and felt a nagging feeling in his gut, a suspicion that something wasn't quite right? It was the kind of unease that lingered, fueled by the stereotypes he had been taught to trust, the biases that had shaped his view of the world. Without thinking, he slowed the car, his eyes still on Amara. She was getting closer to the corner where the street met the park, and her steps seemed calm, deliberate, almost out of place. He leaned over and grabbed the radio mic. Suspect spotted on Maple Street. Approaching the park. Young black female, alone. I'm going to approach and check it out. His voice was steady, professional, but in his mind, the warning signs were already flashing. Something about this felt off, something he couldn't quite put into words. He shifted his focus from the radio back to Amara, who was now at the corner of the block. He parked his car a few yards away, stepping out with a firm, purposeful stride. Amara hadn't noticed him approaching. She was still lost in the pages of her book, her mind far away from the reality that was closing in on her. "Hey!" Officer Daniels called, his voice sharper than intended. Amara jumped, her heart racing for a second before she looked up at him, startled. She hadn't expected to be approached by anyone, especially not a police officer. For a moment, their eyes met, and Amara's face softened. She didn't understand why this officer was stopping her. She had never been in trouble. She wasn't doing anything wrong. "What are you doing here?" Daniels asked, his tone stern. "You're loitering. Why aren't you in school?" Amara blinked, confused by the question. She didn't know how to respond at first. I'm just reading," she said, holding up the book in her hand, trying to show him that she wasn't causing any harm. "I live right over there." She pointed to her house, hoping he would understand. But Daniels didn't seem to care about her explanation. His gaze fixed on her, as if trying to figure out what she was up to, as if her mere presence didn't make sense to him. "Reading?" Daniels repeated, his eyes narrowing. "What's so important about reading, huh? What's in that book of yours?" Amara's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of his suspicion. "It's a history book," she replied quietly, unsure of why the officer was so interested in her book. She wasn't doing anything wrong. It wasn't even a school book, just something her father had given her to help her understand the world better. But Daniels wasn't listening. He took a step forward, and then his eyes locked on the stack of books she had been holding. Without thinking, without a single word of warning, he reached down and snatched the books out of her hands. "Let's see what's so special about these," he muttered, his hands rough as he flipped through the pages. Amara gasped, trying to reach for them. "Please, those are mine! They're not—" Before she could finish, Daniels, frustrated and still clouded by the stereotypes in his mind, acted on impulse. In a rash, unthinking motion, he took the books and threw them into the street, striking a match. In one swift movement, he set them on fire. Amara froze. The flames flickered at first, then spread quickly, consuming the pages, the words, the world that had meant so much to her. She watched in horror as her books, the books her father had given her, the books that connected her to her dreams, burned before her eyes. "There," Daniel said, almost to himself, as if erasing the dangerous ideas he believed the books contained. "Now you can't cause trouble with these anymore." Amara stood there, paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move. Her eyes were fixed on the burning pages, her heart shattered. She wanted to scream, to ask why he did it, but the words wouldn't come. She could only watch as her dreams, her history, and the connection to her father's teachings went up in smoke. Amara stood there, frozen in place, watching the flames dance and twist, devouring the pages of her books. Her world was burning before her eyes, and she felt powerless to stop it. Each book had been more than just paper and ink to her. They were her connection to a world she couldn't always reach, a world her father had taught her to believe in, a world where she could be more than what others saw when they looked at her, where her dreams and ideas could take flight. She had always believed in the power of books, in the promise of knowledge. They had been her comfort on lonely days, her escape when the world felt too heavy to bear. Her father, Professor Jamal, had spent years teaching her that knowledge was the key to unlocking a better future. He'd told her that learning about history, understanding culture, and discovering the stories of those who fought for justice were more than just academic subjects. They were the tools she needed to change the world, but now, those very tools were gone, reduced to ash. Amara's eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she stared at the officer's retreating figure. Officer Daniels had burned her books without a second thought, without understanding what they meant to her. The sting of it went deeper than just the loss of the books. It was the realization that to him, she didn't matter. The books didn't matter. She was just a problem, a danger. She opened her mouth to say something, to scream at him, to demand an explanation, but the words got stuck in her throat. The officer was already walking back to his patrol car, his back straight, his face unmoved, as though he had done nothing wrong. Amara's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She felt so small in that moment, helpless, as if everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, had just been ripped away. What was the point of reading if someone could just take it all away? What was the point of dreaming if the world didn't want her dreams? The officer's car drove off, leaving her standing alone on the side of the street, the smell of burning paper hanging heavy in the air. The world around her seemed distant, muffled, as though the very act of burning her books had made everything else fade into the background. She didn't know how long she stood there, but the reality slowly started to sink in. This wasn't just about the loss of her books. It was about something much bigger, something she hadn't fully understood until now. The world she had thought was fair, the world her father had tried so hard to prepare her for, wasn't like the world in her books. It wasn't a place where knowledge would protect her. It wasn't a place where being smart, kind, or determined meant she would be treated with respect. It was a place where people like Officer Daniels, people who didn't understand her, could take everything from her without a second thought. With a heavy heart, Amara turned and walked slowly back to her house. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but she didn't want to break down, not yet. She couldn't let herself cry, not while her father was still unaware. Meanwhile, across town, Professor Jamal was preparing for his lecture that evening. He stood in his office at the local university, meticulously arranging his notes and adjusting the slides for his presentation. It was an important night. He was set to speak about the history of civil rights in America, about the struggles of black leaders who had fought for equality and justice, and about how far the country still had to go to fulfill its promises of freedom for all. Professor Jamal was a well-respected academic. His books had been published and cited in scholarly journals, and his lectures were often filled with students who admired his wisdom and knowledge. But few people knew the personal battles he fought every day. How, despite his success, he still faced racism and prejudice in ways that most couldn't imagine. Even as a professor, there were those who saw him as something less than equal, less than deserving of the position he had earned. Amara had grown up hearing her father speak about these struggles, hearing him tell stories of his own experiences with discrimination, stories that made her angry and sad, but also determined to stand up for what was right. He had always taught her that change started with knowledge, with education, and with the courage to speak out. He had always believed that one day his work would help shape a better future for her. As he reviewed his lecture notes, his phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up, expecting a call from a colleague or a reminder about the lecture, but when he saw the name on the screen, Amara's school, his heart skipped a beat. The voice on the other end was shaking. "Professor Jamal, we need to talk about something that happened with your daughter." His mind raced, and he could feel a knot tighten in his stomach. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "It's Amara. She was approached by a police officer today. He accused her of loitering and, well, he burned her books." Professor Jamal's blood ran cold. He had heard of stories like this, of people who had faced this kind of prejudice, of children who had been victimized by the ignorance and hatred of others, but he never imagined it would happen to his own daughter. "Burned her books?" he repeated, barely able to process the words. "Why?" "The officer said she was acting suspicious. He didn't seem to care that she was just reading. He destroyed her books, sir. I'm so sorry." The room spun around him. He had always known that the world could be cruel, but this was something different. His daughter, the child he had taught to value education and knowledge, had just had her dreams destroyed, and by someone who was supposed to protect her. "Thank you for letting me know," he said quietly, trying to steady his breath. He ended the call, his hand gripping the phone tightly. His mind raced, but his thoughts felt jumbled. His heart hurt for Amara, for the injustice she had just experienced. He had taught her to stand tall, to never let the world define her, but how could he teach her that when the world itself seemed so broken? Amara's pain became his pain. His daughter, who had believed in books and knowledge as the path to a better future, had just had that path ripped away. And he realized, with a heavy heart, that this wasn't just a moment of personal injustice. It was a moment that echoed through history. A history of Black people being silenced, of their voices and stories being erased, of their value being overlooked. Professor Jamal sat down at his desk, his hands shaking as he prepared to face his next lecture. But tonight, his words would be different. Tonight, he would speak not only of history, but of the urgent need for change. And in his heart, he knew that, for Amara, the journey toward justice had only just begun. The news of Amara's books being burned spread quickly through Briarwood, first through whispers between neighbors, then across social media, and finally to the local news stations. It wasn't long before the story was the talk of the town, and soon it caught the attention of the wider community. At first, no one knew the full scope of what had happened. They just knew that a young Black girl had been treated unfairly by a police officer, an incident that felt all too familiar, but one that still sparked outrage. Amara's classmates at school began to ask questions, their confusion turning to disbelief as they learned of the officer's actions. They couldn't understand why anyone would burn her books. Books. Her books were her everything. How could anyone destroy them like that? The situation quickly gained momentum as more people joined the conversation. Parents in the community expressed their anger. "How could this happen in our town?" they asked. People rallied behind Amara, some organizing peaceful protests to demand justice. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was being shared nationally. But what most people didn't know was that Amara's father, Professor Jamal, was no ordinary academic. His work on race relations and history had made waves in academic circles across the globe. Though he had remained relatively low profile in Briarwood, his research and teachings had reached audiences far beyond the town's small borders. He was a respected voice in the conversation about civil rights, with articles published in major journals and appearances at international conferences. He had even worked with advocacy groups that sought to change the systemic inequalities in education, law enforcement, and public policy. The media soon discovered his identity, and everything changed. His name flooded the headlines, and his colleagues and former students began to speak out in his defense. The story wasn't just about an officer burning a young girl's books anymore. It was about a renowned scholar whose family had been targeted by a racist act, and the backlash came swiftly. In the heart of Briarwood, though, the real pressure began to build in ways that even the media couldn't capture. Officer Daniels began to feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. At first, he had dismissed the incident as a minor mistake, something he could sweep under the rug. But as the days passed and the news spread, he started to realize that his actions might have far-reaching consequences. As the media storm surrounding the incident grew, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't used to being under such scrutiny. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people made mistakes. He had certainly made his own over the years. But the way this situation was unfolding was different. Amara's story had sparked an outpouring of support from the community. Local leaders spoke out against the injustice, demanding an investigation. People who had previously turned a blind eye to incidents of racial prejudice were now asking tough questions about the police department's role in perpetuating discrimination. The situation wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was a national conversation about race, justice, and the abuses of power. But the real turning point came when people began to learn who Amara's father was. As word spread that Professor Jamal was a globally respected scholar, the attention on the case intensified. Media outlets clamored for interviews. Social media exploded with posts from both supporters and critics. People were furious that an officer had destroyed the property of someone so prominent, someone whose work had shaped the conversation around race in ways that even government leaders had acknowledged. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about the systemic problems of racism and injustice, and the story had become a rallying cry for those who had fought for equality. The weight of this newfound attention hit Officer Daniels like a ton of bricks. In his mind, he had simply seen a young girl, a black girl, standing in the street reading. That was his first mistake, his assumption that she was a threat. But what he didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn, was who Amara's family really was. Now, as the media began to highlight Professor Jamal's credentials and his contributions to racial justice, Daniel's stomach twisted in knots. Why didn't I know? He kept asking himself. Why didn't I just look into this girl's family? For the first time, he realized that his rash actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. His mind raced. He thought back to the moment when he had burned Amara's books. He hadn't just destroyed some random collection of pages. He had targeted a symbol of resistance, education, and cultural pride. And he hadn't even realized it. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't that bad, that maybe things would blow over. But with every new report, every new interview, the pressure mounted. His fellow officers began to avoid him, his colleagues at the precinct growing more distant. People in town had started talking, some in support of him, many not. The whispers turned to rumors, and the rumors turned to accusations. Was this a case of racism? Was he just another officer abusing his power? What made matters worse was that Daniel's own ignorance about Amara's family was beginning to haunt him. He had no idea who Professor Jamal was, or how significant the man's work had been in challenging systemic racism. He thought he had made a quick judgment, a decision that was based on what he had been taught about people like Amara. He thought he could control the situation. But now, with the entire country watching, Daniels began to realize that he had made a deadly mistake. The more he thought about it, the more he understood just how badly he had underestimated the situation. He had thought of Amara as a threat, a potential troublemaker, a symbol of something he didn't understand. And in doing so, he had underestimated the power of her father's legacy, the significance of his family's story. The realization sank in deeper with every new report. The very man who had given so much of his life to educate others about the history of racial injustice had just watched his daughter's history, his legacy, be burned by a police officer who hadn't even bothered to ask one simple question: who are they? The air outside the Briarwood police station was thick with tension. The streets, once quiet and ordinary, were filled with people, neighbors, activists, friends, and even some strangers who had heard about what had happened to Amara. They were gathered in support of her, a sea of signs, peaceful chants, and determined faces. Professor Jamal stood at the forefront of the crowd, his tall frame casting a long shadow under the midday sun. His eyes were focused, but behind the quiet strength was a storm of emotions. He had heard the news reports, read the messages of support, and seen the interviews with his colleagues, his students, and his friends. But today, he was not just a professor or a public figure. Today, he was a father who had seen his daughter's spirit broken, her dreams torn apart by the very system that was supposed to protect her. He turned to look at Amara, who stood beside him, her expression steady, but her eyes filled with a deep sorrow that spoke volumes. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Amara nodded, though the weight of the moment hung heavily on her shoulders. "I'm ready," she said, her voice soft but resolute. And with that, they walked together toward the police station. Inside the building, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, his face pale. The news had reached him, the wave of attention he had tried so hard to avoid crashing down on him. He had spent the last few days trying to convince himself that everything would just blow over. But as each hour passed, his guilt grew. The phone calls from his superiors, the whispers from his colleagues, the articles in the papers, all of it was becoming too much to ignore. Now he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The sound grew louder until it stopped outside his office. His heart pounded in his chest. He looked up to see Professor Jamal walk in, followed closely by Amara. Her eyes focused on the ground, but her presence undeniable. Daniel stood up quickly, his mind scrambling for something to say, anything to ease the weight of what was happening. "Professor Jamal, Amara," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I didn't expect," he faltered. "No," Jamal interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't expect this." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. Daniel swallowed, looking nervously at Amara. He didn't know how to face her, how to face the family he had wronged so deeply. He had no idea who they truly were when he first saw Amara on the street. He hadn't known that he was standing in front of a man who had fought for civil rights his entire life, a man whose work had shaped the lives of countless people. He hadn't known the full weight of the injustice he was committing. But now, with Professor Jamal standing before him, Daniels saw the full impact of his mistake. The man he had dismissed as just another black father was someone who had written about systems of oppression, someone who had taught people about how prejudice and hate had shaped the world for generations. And Amara, she was his daughter. She wasn't just any girl on the street. She wasn't just a suspicious figure. She was the daughter of a man who had devoted his life to fighting injustice, and in doing so, he had unknowingly become a symbol of the very thing Officer Daniels had tried to erase. "I know you're here to apologize," Jamal said, his tone measured but not without pain. But an apology isn't enough. Not this time. Daniels opened his mouth, but the words failed him. What could he say? What could he possibly say that would undo the damage he had caused? He had burned Amara's books, her future, her connection to her culture, to her family's legacy, without even understanding the depth of what he was destroying. And then Amara stepped forward. Amara had stood silently at her father's side, but now she could no longer stay quiet. She felt the weight of the crowd outside, the eyes of her classmates, her friends, and even strangers who had shown up to support her. The thought of them gave her the strength she needed. She lifted her head and looked straight at Officer Daniels. "You think burning my books was just about burning paper?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a rawness that made her words cut deep. "You think I'm just a little girl with no voice? Someone you can just dismiss?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, but Amara didn't look away. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She was someone who had learned the power of her voice, even in the face of pain. "Those books, they weren't just stories," Amara continued, her voice gaining strength. "They were my dreams, my future, my father's history. When you burned them, you didn't just burn paper. You burned my chance to see the world in a way that makes sense. You burned my connection to people who fought for justice. You burned the path I thought I could walk down, the path that could have made me something more than what you saw when you looked at me." There was a pause, and for the first time since the incident, Officer Daniels felt a twinge of something he hadn't felt before: shame. Amara's words had cracked through the walls he had built around his own prejudices. In that moment, he understood the depth of what he had done. Her voice didn't just echo in the room. It reverberated in his mind, forcing him to confront his own biases, his own narrow worldview. "I was just doing my job," he had told himself at first. But now he realized that his job wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding, about respecting humanity. "Amara," Jamal said softly, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You've done enough. It's time for us to make our voices heard." Amara turned to her father and nodded, her heart still racing but her spirit unbroken. This wasn't just about the books anymore. It was about justice. It was about the truth of their history and the need for change. Outside the station, the crowd had grown even larger, their voices rising in a unified chorus. The chants were simple but powerful. "Justice for Amara! Books are not crimes! We won't be silenced!" It was a visual moment, one that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Amara's face had become the face of resistance, her courage inspiring others to stand up against the systems that sought to silence them. Amara and her father knew that this was just the beginning. They weren't just fighting for her books. They were fighting for a future where no child, no family, would ever have to face the kind of prejudice and injustice that had scarred their lives. And as they stood there side by side, Amara's voice became not just her own. It became the voice of every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had ever been silenced, who had ever been ignored. In that moment, everyone who had gathered understood. The fight for justice was far from over. The days following the confrontation were heavy with change, both for Officer Daniels and the community. Briarwood was never the same, not after what had happened to Amara and her family. The quiet suburban town was now a place where people could no longer turn a blind eye to injustice. Conversations had started. Hard, honest conversations about race, privilege, and the biases that influenced every part of life, from the way people were treated on the streets to the way they were educated. For Officer Daniels, the change had been the hardest. The guilt weighed on him like a physical burden. He had never really thought about what his actions could mean for someone like Amara, someone who had done nothing wrong but had been victimized simply for being herself. Her books, her dreams, her future, they had all been taken away in an instant because of a prejudice he didn't even know he was carrying. Sitting alone in his apartment late one night, he finally found the courage to face his mistake. He thought back to the moment when he had burned Amara's books, the moment when he had dismissed her, thinking she was a threat, simply because she was young, black, and standing in the street with a book in her hand. "I was wrong," he whispered to himself. "I was so wrong." The realization cut deep. Officer Daniels wasn't just sorry for burning the books. He was sorry for seeing Amara and so many others through the lens of his own biases, instead of seeing them for who they truly were. And so, Officer Daniels took responsibility. He didn't hide behind excuses or try to justify his actions. He apologized, not just to Amara, but to the entire community. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary. The following week, he stood in front of a gathering of local leaders, activists, and community members. With Professor Jamal and Amara sitting in the front row, Daniels spoke from his heart. "I was wrong," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I let my biases control my actions. I didn't see Amara for who she really is. I didn't see her as a daughter, a student, a person with dreams. I saw her as something I couldn't understand, and I reacted out of fear. That's not the kind of officer I want to be, and it's not the kind of person I want to be. I'm sorry. I'll do better." The room was silent for a moment, but then something unexpected happened. Professor Jamal stood up, his calm, steady voice breaking the quiet. "We all have biases," he said, looking directly at Daniels. "It's not enough to just recognize them. You have to confront them, and it takes courage to do that. Today, you've shown that courage. That's the first step." Daniels nodded, grateful for Jamal's words, but he knew it didn't end there. The apology wasn't enough to undo the hurt he had caused, but it was a start. It was a beginning of change, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed the events that had unfolded. The day after the apology, something beautiful happened. Amara, standing in the center of the community center, held a small stack of books in her hands. These weren't just any books. They were her new books, gifted to her by her father, her friends, and even the people of Briarwood who had shown up in support of her. Each book had a note in it, written by someone who believed in her, who believed in the power of education, and who believed that her future was too important to be defined by a single painful moment. Amara smiled as she flipped through the pages of her new books. These weren't just replacements for what had been lost. They were symbols of resilience, of community, and of hope. She had dreamed of becoming someone who could change the world through knowledge, through understanding, and through empathy. And now, with her books in hand, she felt that dream was once again within reach. Her father, standing beside her, looked on with pride. "These books are a new beginning," Professor Jamal said softly. "Not just for you, Amara, but for all of us. This is a reminder that we can rebuild, we can grow, and we can create a world where people are seen for who they are, not for what others assume them to be." Amara nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She had come through this experience stronger, not just because of the support she had received, but because of the strength she had found within herself. And as she looked out at the faces of the people around her, some familiar, some new, she realized that this was how change happened. It wasn't a big, sweeping gesture. It was a small, brave act of standing up, of speaking out, and of refusing to be silenced. And that, she knew, would ripple out into the world, one act of courage at a time. The story of Amara's books wasn't just about one wrong being righted. It was about the journey that followed, a journey where everyone had a part to play. From Amara's bravery to Officer Daniels' reflection and Professor Jamal's guidance, this was a story of people confronting their biases and finding the courage to do better. And as Amara stood there, holding her books, she knew that racism hadn't been erased overnight. It still existed in the world, in many forms, in many places. But she had learned something valuable, that real change starts with understanding. It starts with each of us asking ourselves hard questions and challenging the beliefs that we hold without even realizing it. Amara's journey was just one story, but it was a story that showed how important it is to see one another clearly, to listen to each other and to recognize that we all have something to teach and something to learn. The road ahead was long, but with each small act of bravery, each small act of understanding, the world could change. And in the end, it was the little things, the conversations, the apologies, the books that mattered most.